project of a choreographed conversation which he did in the 70s, and is another reason to think of history as occurring in cycles and coming back, and us trying to break the loop sometimes, as one of the others mentioned just now. I was touched by all of it, and particularly the question of the sound of justice, but also the question of how do we listen to those who are missing. And before I introduce the next panelist, I thought I'd say a couple of words about the video that follows this panel and the Q&A. It is by Carlos Mota, and it is described in your programs. It's called Nefandus and is from 2013. Part of a comprehensive project that explores the imposition of European epistemological categories onto native cultures during the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the Americas. And I'm quoting from him because it relates to the question of listening to those who are missing. In Carlos' words, the description of this video, which lasts about 13 minutes, is Nefandus is a narrative video that investigates pre-Hispanic homosexuality. While it has been widely documented that the conquistadores used sex as a weapon of domination of indigenous populations, little is known about the homoerotic indigenous traditions. How did the Christian morality, as taught by the Catholic missions and propagated through war during conquest, transform the natives' relationship with sex? Nefandus, Latin for impious, abominable, or unnameable, was a common word used in colonial Latin America in reference to sin. A pecado nefando, an unspeakable sin, was a transgressive crime of sexual nature which was severely judged and punished. The video suggests that constructions of sexuality and the body can be projected onto cultures whose traditions and histories remain unknown and have been mediated by European classifications. So this, as kind of a segue between the performance we just participated in and the panel, which is investigating performance strategies as organizing principles for activism, and looks at the critical enactment of gender identities in distributed or consolidated physical as well as virtual spaces, and is addressed by a number of speakers. And I am just introducing the moderator, Daniel Garza-Usabiaga, who will then introduce everyone else. Daniel is, center of the table, is the chief curator of the Museo Universitario del Chopo. Among his projects are exhibitions at the Museo de Arte Moderno, where he was a curator until 2012, among them Max Cheto in 2011, Cinetismo, Movimiento e Transformación en el Arte de los 60s and 70s, which was presented in 2012, and at Chopo he has curated a number of exhibitions, among them Arte y Animación, Sexo, Drogas, Rock and Roll, Arte y Cultura de Masas in Mexico from 1963 to 1971, and also an exhibition called Horror and El Tropic. He is the author of a couple of books, among them Matías Göritz y la Arquitectura Emocional. Then he was awarded for his writings the Premio Bellas Artes Luis Cardosa y Aragón. And together with Oscar Benassini, he founded the editorial initiative Solidaridad Press. Daniel holds a PhD in History and Art Theory from Essex University. He has also pursued postdoctoral studies at the Instituto de Investigación Estética ad UNAM. He's a professor of art history and postdoctoral studies at the Facultad de Filosofía and Letras at UNAM. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Mr. Panels. Thank you to you.
Muy buenas tardes y muchas gracias por la invitación a este SITAC. Y bueno, voy a ir presentando a las ponentes de acuerdo como vayan sus presentaciones. Entonces vamos a empezar con Amaranta Gómez Regalado, que es mucha indígena zapoteca, originaria de la ciudad de Juchitán, en Oaxaca, activista social desde hace más de 19 años en el ámbito local, regional e internacional en temas de salud, sexualidad, identidades de género ancestrales, derechos humanos y promoción cultural. Es fundadora del colectivo Vini Lanu, y también es la primera candidata mushe trans a diputada federal por el expartido México Posible. También es integrante del mecanismo coordinador del país del Fondo Mundial para el SIDA en México, representando a la comunidad mushe trans. Actualmente es secretaria regional mushe trans de ILGALAC para América Latina y el Caribe.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. Tengo el PowerPoint aquí. Gracias. Voy a proyectarlo. Ok, ya está. Ok. Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Quiero agradecer a Karim, a María Bostó, a Demián Flores, amigo de muchos frentes, a la curtiduría por haberme sugerido en esta edición del SITAC. Si bien es cierto, me invitaron a hablar sobre la experiencia mushe entendida desde este performance que acuña Judith Butler desde hace mucho tiempo, le di muchas vueltas y decía yo que la urgencia nacional, la crisis nacional que vivimos ante la situación de las injusticias y el llamado por la justicia que estamos haciendo, y en estos 3 días lo hemos tenido, parecía que hablar solamente de lo mushe implicaría un protagonismo y un individualismo en las formas de pensar que en este momento no tienen pertinencia, me parece. Pero sí voy a hacer alguna mención, pero vinculándolo con para hablar sobre la situación, el estado del arte, de la discriminación, por lo menos en México. Me voy a detener un poco para reflexionar sobre qué estamos entendiendo de lo trans y cómo se confronta con el tema de otras identidades indígenas, otras identidades de género indígenas. Para luego tratar de vincular un poco esto con un concepto que desde el zapoteco quiero plantearles, y les aviento un reto a los artistas que estén aquí para ver cómo le hacemos para poder vincular las acciones entre el arte, las identidades y la lucha social. En el zapoteco tenemos un concepto que se llama genda, y desde nuestro punto de vista es una forma de mirar al mundo para la justicia. El genda es el don o virtud con que una persona nace o se le otorga a una persona o un hecho. Podemos decir que gendaranashi es el don de amar, gendarakané es el don de ayudar, el gendalizar es el don de emparentar más allá de la consanguinidad que pudiese significar este concepto. Por lo tanto, una invitación a pensar qué tanto está vigente nuestra virtud y nuestro don de poder solidarizarnos con agendas que a veces, muchas veces nos parecen extrañas, nos parecen desde lejos, desconocemos, y muchas veces por ignorancia y por desinformación creamos muchos prejuicios. Y uno de los temas en México particularmente es el prejuicio y la discriminación. Hay una encuesta que me gustaría compartirles rápidamente, que lo creó el Consejo Nacional para Prevenir y Eliminar la Discriminación, y nos dicen que 6 de cada 10 personas que nuestro país considera que la riqueza, acumulada en unos cuantos nada más, es un factor importantísimo que divide a la sociedad, seguido de los partidos políticos y la educación. México es tan desigual, pero al mismo tiempo tan racista, que muchas veces el consumo que hacemos diariamente de los medios de comunicación nos lleva a consumir modelos. Hoy en día, por ejemplo, se les pregunta a la gente con qué color se identifica más, y cada vez más, en el caso de las mujeres, se identifican más hacia el color blanco que al tema negro. En el caso de los hombres, no hay no es tan marcado, porque bueno, se refrenda esto que decíamos, que los hombres mexicanos son hombres fuertes y formales, feos, fuertes y formales, ¿no? También están estos estereotipos que hemos construido. 4 de cada 10 mexicanos no estaría dispuesto a permitir que en su casa vivieran personas homosexuales. 3 de cada 10 personas afirman lo mismo en el caso de las personas que viven con VIH. 6 de cada 10 mexicanos piensan que los derechos de las personas homosexuales, lesbianas, indígenas, inmigrantes son los que se respetan muy poco, ¿no? En el caso de los jóvenes, poco más de 3 de cada 10 personas consideran que la preparación insuficiente, la apariencia y la inexperiencia son los motivos por que no fueron aceptados en un trabajo. Particularmente, el tema de los jóvenes es bastante alarmante y el desempleo es una realidad en México. 3 de cada 10 personas que pertenecen a una minoría religiosa frente al catolicismo, que se asume la norma, considera que sus principales problemas son el rechazo, la falta de aceptación, la burla y la exclusión de las comunidades. 3 de cada 10 niños y niñas dijeron que sus papás les han hecho llorar y 1 de cada 4 le han pegado en su casa. Tema tan vigente pero que nadie quiere hablar o la gente habla muy poco es de los migrantes. 6 de cada 10 migrantes consideran que se respetan poco o nada sus derechos humanos en nuestro país, a pesar de tener una tarjeta que está aprobada para transitar 3 meses libremente en el país. Un tema que no había aparecido, pero además afortunadamente empieza a aparecer, y recuerdo mucho a Gilberto Rincón Gallardo cuando se creó el CONAPRED, insistía en que había un sector que no estaba considerado, las trabajadoras domésticas en este país, que resuelve muchos de los problemas cotidianos en la vida de muchos mexicanos. Una tercera parte de las personas que se dedican al trabajo del hogar señala que el principal problema para quienes realizan estas tareas es el sueldo, el bajo sueldo, seguido por los abusos, que incluye abuso sexual también, maltrato, humillación, discriminación. El principal problema que consideran las minorías étnicas es la discriminación, seguido de la pobreza y el desempleo. El tema de la lengua, hasta hoy en día todavía tenemos, la gente le da vergüenza hablar el zapoteco o otra lengua. Recuerdo la experiencia de un chico que se asume, que es náhuatl y que se asumía como gay. Él decía que lo gay no le preocupaba ser indio. 1 de cada 2 personas lesbianas, homosexuales o bisexuales considera que el principal problema que enfrenta es la discriminación, seguido de la falta de aceptación, críticas y burlas. Me quiero detener ahora para reflexionar un poco sobre la lucha entre lo transgénero y otras identidades de géneros indígenas. A lo largo de este trabajo que he estado haciendo, he identificado y he conocido algunas experiencias en varios países, y yo pensaba, bueno, cuando uno no conoce o no sale de su pueblo, de su país, piensas que, bueno, tú eres el ombligo del mundo, y en realidad los muchos no éramos el ombligo del mundo, sino había otras identidades de géneros similares, ¿no? Y voy descubriendo que en la India pues están las isras, ¿no? En Canadá, los Two-Spirit, los Fa-Fafine en la Polinesia, los Omequit en Panamá, en los pueblos cunas, los Berdache en Estados Unidos. Identidades que inmediatamente cuando se colocan en el terreno de lo público y en el discurso occidental, solemos o se suele decir que más bien nos intentan encajonar en el concepto transgénero. Para mí es un asunto que antepone una idea homogenizadora, rompe la posibilidad de que se pueda reconocer en un diálogo intercultural estas propias identidades. Es decir, lo trans, si bien es cierto, viene acompañado de un proceso modernizador, no tendría por qué ser la caja en donde habría que colocar estas otras identidades. Me parece que la gran oportunidad que tenemos para reconocer estas otras identidades es la interculturalidad. La riqueza que existe para reconocer esa otra edad es una forma de hacer justicia, de hacernos justicia a nosotros mismos y a nosotras mismas. Pensaba un poco en lo que decía Lidia Cacho el primer día, ¿no? ¿Qué entendemos por justicia? Y me parece que tendríamos que empezar a pensar en la justicia que estaría ella a mi lado y reconocer la riqueza que ella tiene, en tanto que tiene su propia identidad, su propia historia, su propio contexto, su propia cultura. Y a partir de eso, reconocer la riqueza del otro es una forma de empezar a hacernos justicia más allá de este proceso legaloide que en un momento dado nos alude la palabra justicia. Y ahí me parece que el gendalizar, el don de emparentar, el don de solidarizarse, más allá de esto que decíamos, la consanguinidad, puede crear estas afectividades, estas solidaridades. ¿Qué si compartimos las personas trans y las personas de otras, las islas, las FA, FINA, de la Polinesia y demás, ¿no? Compartimos la violencia y la falta de justicia. Compartimos injusticias familiares. Hay rechazo, por supuesto, hay una, si bien es cierto en el campo, en el istmo de Tehuantepec, sobresale esta identidad, tiene mecanismos. Por ejemplo, el proceso de aceptación no se vive de manera individual o solamente mamá y papá, sino más bien es un proceso colectivo. La señora que vende la tortilla, el señor que vende el pan, que viene en la mañana, se entera. El cuerpo de las personas mujeres entre los 6 y 12 años se va socializando. La cultura va moldeando y va reconociendo que hay un espacio histórico en donde juega, donde se le coloca, y hay roles que cumple y dentro de la propia cultura. Sin embargo, veo en otras culturas y en el caso de las personas transgéneros en las ciudades, por ejemplo, veo que hay mucho rechazo con respecto al tema de la familia. Las injusticias sociales, una de las cosas, el imaginario social y lo que me parece que muchas veces intencionalmente el Estado provoca, es que pareciera ser que las personas transgéneros tendríamos que tener solamente como único destino trabajar en la prostitución y ser peinadoras o estilistas. Como si fuera el único ámbito donde podríamos desarrollar nuestras capacidades, nuestra intelectualidad, nuestra oratoria o nuestro baile, cualquier otra cosa. Ese reducto social y culturalmente se asume que esos son los únicos terrenos que tendríamos que descubrirnos. Y no. Necesitamos hacernos justicia y abrir un poco más la brecha. El pastel es bastante grande, pero la rebanada es muy pequeña. Me parece que hay justicia institucional. Yo ahora estoy a punto de titularme el próximo mayo, espero que sí. Espero que sí, como antropóloga social. Pero cuando termino la primaria y asumo mi identidad femenina y vivir como mujer, intento ir a la secundaria y no hay manera. Entonces, la mayoría de las personas transgéneros, incluyendo las omequis, los mushes y demás, sufrimos deserción escolar. Y eso es una injusticia, que habría que cambiar el chip cultural, ¿no? ¿Por qué unos sí tendrían derecho? Ese mundo binario, esa heteronormatividad, ¿no? Que no nos deja o no nos permite colocarnos en estos puntos. Y finalmente, claro, el destino es la prostitución o el estilismo. Que bueno, que ambas cosas son valiosas también, pero no tendrían que ser los únicos destinos. La deserción escolar es dramática. Y luego tenemos, por supuesto, la injusticia legal. Hasta hoy en día Argentina es el único país, bueno, sí, que tiene una ley nacional. Y en México, solamente en la Ciudad de México, y el próximo 30 entra en vigor el cambio de Código Civil que hubo aquí en el Distrito Federal. Pero ahora, afortunadamente, para cambiarte el acta de nacimiento y que te llames Jorge, que te llames Amaranta, que te llames Pedro y que te llames Soledad, anteriormente había una idea patologizadora para poder hacerlo. Teníamos que pagar 30,000 pesos, 40,000 pesos a 2 dictámenes de un terapeuta y un psicólogo o un sexólogo para decir si no estabas loco o no estabas loca. Y ahora, bueno, se quitó eso y pagaba 5,000 pesos para el trámite. Ahora se van a pagar 80 pesos como si hubieras tramitado cualquier otro tipo de acta de nacimiento. Solo la Ciudad de México lo tenemos. Son ausencias, el centralismo, bueno, y además la oportunidad que algunos gobiernos, ¿no?, de izquierda proponen y avanzan, pero en el país tenemos muchas ausencias. Y bueno, me parece que las propuestas tienen que ir en que pudiéramos superar nuestras barreras culturales. Eso cuesta, duele incluso, ¿no? Pero sí aprender del otro y de la otra. Superar nuestra visión parcelaria de nuestros grupos, ¿no? Estas agenditas aquí, el grupo allá, el otro allá. No hay estas intersecciones, no hay este gendalizar que tendríamos que tener. Evocando el genda, el don que llevamos adentro, necesitamos despertarlo. Creo que Ayotzinapa sí nos logró despertarlo, ¿no? Pero me parece que esperar cuántos Ayotzinapas. No quiero esperar más Ayotzinapas. Y me parece que el arte tendría que apostarle a interpelar y sacar desde donde está todavía ausente ese don de las personas para no esperar más Ayotzinapas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Amaranta, por tu presentación. Vamos a seguir con Micha Ca, quien es artista teórica, estudiante y académica. Crea y estudia el color del movimiento trans en medios digitales, donde el movimiento involucra performance, migración, movilidad urbana y movimientos sociales. Micha es miembro de Provost y candidato doctoral en Media Arts and Practice en la Universidad del Sur de California y miembro del colectivo artístico Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0. El trabajo individual y colectivo de Micha ha sido expuesto en museos, galerías, bienales, conferencias magistrales, espacios públicos y colectivos alrededor del mundo. Muchas gracias, Micha, por estar aquí.
Primero quiero decir perdón que me voy a hablar en inglés, porque quiero hablar precisamente y diuréticamente y no quiero hablar más lente. Okay, sorry. Yes, so first I just want to thank Karin and Lucia and Maria and all the organizers of this event. It's really the incredibly gracious hospitality. I'm very honored to be here. So thank you all. Secondly, I want to talk about this project I've worked on for the last 4 years. It's called Local Autonomy Networks, or AutoNets for short. And the project was aimed at preventing violence against trans women of color, and in doing so, contributing to ending violence against people of color, cisgender women, disabled people, and sex workers. The project started with wearable electronic prototypes, which you see here in the photos, with a line of clothing that contains wireless transmitters to send out an emergency signal using mesh networking to anyone else who had a similar garment, an AutoNets garment that I made, to build community-based responses to violence. So I made this line of clothing that had wireless transmitters in them because I believe that trans people cannot rely on corporations or police to keep us safe. So the idea is that these garments in a case of violence, you would contact people in the safety network that you have built, so your friends. So relying on ourselves to keep ourselves safe. But there's this particular optics of transgender politics, right? That we want to be unseen until we decide we want to be visible. So these electronics, like this is the XB wireless transmitter I was using. These electronics were sort of buried in the seams of the garment. So you couldn't actually see that this dress or hoodie was anything special until it was activated. And so I used these garments, these prototypes, to start conversations about how to build community-based responses to violence in 13 cities in the US, Canada, Brazil, and Germany. And so in these workshops, I asked participants the question of what does violence feel like in your body? Or what does safety feel like or look like in your body? To be practicing this process of envisioning the futures that we want. And some participants said, I don't know what safety feels like. I've never felt safe. So I asked them to, to speculate and imagine, because I don't think that the future should only belong to Hollywood and to people who, very few people that are often asked to envision the future. So collectively, using Theater of the Oppressed, we developed these performances and many different performances in different cities. So I wanted to show an excerpt from one of them now so you can get an idea of what this looked like. Okay, so just a tiny little sampling. Yes, so here's an image from one of the workshops. This one was in Detroit. In the project, I really focused on Los Angeles, Detroit, and Toronto. And I worked with local organizations, so that performance was made with Gender Justice LA. And this image is from the Allied Media Projects. You could actually turn the lights up in the audience. That would be nice, because I find it very dark in here and hard to concentrate. So if the person in charge of the lights could turn the lights on the audience, that'd be great. Then we could be more participatory. I think things should be participatory. Okay, so I just want to start with the basics, because I feel like that's necessary. So perhaps the most basic tenet of gender justice is gender autonomy. Someone's gender is whatever they say it is, or whatever they perform it to be. And it's not the viewers or the person who's receiving that performance to decide what somebody's gender is. And that gender may be male or female, or it may be dragon, or light wave, or robot, or whatever you want. Because each person can create their own gender, and we don't have to be limited to these binaries of male and female, but we only have words like male and female. You didn't turn the lights up on the audience. Por favor, más luces a la audiencia. Okay. So starting with the basics, right? So regardless of what somebody's biology is, whatever they say their gender is, that is what you should respect. Trans women have been historically excluded from feminism in North America. Today, trans women of color are the #1 target of violence amongst LGBTQ people, as far as I know in the US, documented by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects. And year after year, more trans women of color are murdered. And within this broad, complex grouping that's trans women of color, that's two complex groupings that are put together very fuzzy, Black trans women are still the #1 target of violence. So things that Michael was saying earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement is very relevant here. Yesterday, as he said, Lamia Beard, a Black trans woman, was murdered in Norfolk, Virginia while we were partying. And the media reports of her death erased and ignored her gender identity. So any feminism today that does not explicitly address the violence faced by transgender women actually reproduces, authorizes, and facilitates the violence that they face by maintaining their exclusion. Additionally, the mainstream white, middle-class, gay, and lesbian movement has left transgender safety to be prioritized far lower than marriage or LGBT participation in the military. The history of trans women of color leading the LGBT rights movement, both at Stonewall and the Compton's cafeteria riot, and for centuries throughout history, indigenous people like the Mushe and Hijras, has been largely ignored by the LGBT rights movement in North America. So trans misogyny, so I'm still going through the basics here, is the very real confluence, the coming together, the simultaneity of transphobia and misogyny. So it's the way that trans women are both discredited for being female and pathologized for being transgender, which makes both experiences worse, right? So not only is trans feminism essential to feminism today, what is needed, I propose, is a trans of color feminism to address the violence faced by trans women of color. And just as feminism is not a task only for women, trans of color feminism is a task for everyone. Often trans misogyny works in very personal ways. Much like Audre Lorde described the way that racism worked in the feminist movement to exclude women of color, it's often a question of who gets invited to the party, or who gets talked to at dinner, or who is invited to present their artwork. So the small interpersonal dynamics, like respecting the pronouns that a trans person chooses to use, is essential to maintaining their safety. It's not just a matter of politeness. Often trans people do not want to be outed as trans. So again, this optics of trans politics is that you should never identify someone as trans unless they are doing so in the same context that you were in. Unfortunately, okay, so I only have a few minutes left. Right, unfortunately, I don't want to take all my time talking about the basics because it's actually not my responsibility to educate you about trans politics if you are not trans. It is your responsibility, just like other forms of solidarity, to learn about trans struggles. So, moving on to the theoretical part with the last few minutes. Trans people know through the daily experience what it means to be a disposable body under necropolitics. The organization Transgender Europe has a transgender murder monitoring project which reported 226 murders of trans people in 2014, as of October of 2014. Yet, as Francisco Galarte points out in his articles, Trans Chicanas, many rural trans people's deaths go unnoticed, so surely the number is higher. We could estimate that nearly every day a trans person is killed in the world. Due to extreme isolation and marginalization we face, often our deaths pass without being mourned, without public outcry, without any sense of national tragedy. By understanding the experiences of trans people of color, I propose we can better understand necropolitics. I would say actually understanding the Black Lives Matter movement and the deaths of trans women of color is the most important way, the best way, and the 43 Ayotzinapa, right? Understanding these disposable bodies is the best way to understand contemporary politics. As Akil Mbembe describes necropolitics, moving on from the idea of biopolitics, right, where the job of the government was the promise of life. Whereas today, we live under necropolitics, which is the government's job is not only the promise of life, but also the guarantee of death for those who are undesired. So I really, again, appreciate Ultra Red's work, and it reminds me of the Allied Media Project's Politics That Say We Begin by Listening. This is perhaps my main thing for you today, is listen to trans women of color, because we know best how to keep ourselves alive. We do it every day. And listen to Black people, and listen to students and people who are marginalized and being disappeared. So as Laverne Cox, a Black trans actress made famous by Netflix's digital video streaming service, who recently was on the cover of Time magazine, she stated that we are in a state of emergency for trans people. So this invites us to reconsider the state of exception and Akil Mbembe's linking of the state of exception to colonial forms of governance through necropolitics. So Mbembe describes new forms of management of visibility which facilitates necropolitics under digital capitalism, such as hologramization and invisible killing. And he points out that death under necropolitics does not have to be carried out by state actors. It can simply be allowed through neglect, right? So here with neglect, I'm not only talking about the neglect of the government of certain regions and certain people, also I'm talking about the neglect of activists and feminists of certain people. So there's much to learn from trans people whose lived experience is one of managing our own visibility, of shifting our visibility as situations require for our safety. To work for the safety of trans women, I said that. So I propose that the shift is a material conceptual operator that can be added to the repertoire of operators for thought and action like the cut and the fold described by Deleuze and Guattari. So as Raina Gossett, activist and writer, points out, the increase of visibility for trans people means increased surveillance. In her writing, she points out that one of the main forms of violence against trans people is prisons, police, and state violence. Like Lydia Cacho, I agree and very much also work for transformative justice and prison abolition. I would say we cannot have, like as Raina Gossett says, we cannot have gender justice without ending the prison industrial complex, which also includes immigration detention centers. Okay, sweet. Almost 1 minute and 2 paragraphs. Okay. Whew. Additionally, we can understand the recent increase in global transgender rights legislation as a form of colonialism that propagates Western medical systems for managing gender and Western conceptions of identity, unless it is, so it's a form of colonialism if it is used to erase forms of gender nonconformity such as the mouche and hijras, instead of to build solidarity. So there's that danger, right? The transgender either can be used as a system of colonialism to continue to propagate US and global North hegemony, or it can be used as solidarity from below. So to decolonize this idea of transgender, I would say we can look to women of color feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa, who says, I know things older than Freud, older than gender. That we could understand the gender binary as a colonial tool used by Spanish colonizers such as Balboa to murder gender non-conforming native people. Still, Bolivian indigenous feminists Julieta Paredes writes in Hilando Fino that in some cultures, patriarchy is older than colonialism. So simply working for decolonization is not going to bring us about gender justice by itself. So, to conclude, despite some theorists' desire to move beyond identity, the social reality persists today that in many structures, especially in contemporary art, rich white men rule through their privilege. While trans people of color are very large categories with very uncertain, fuzzy boundaries, their confluence still points year after year to a group of people who are consistently murdered. My work uses digital media to create prototypes and workshops to teach concrete skills such as safe calls, text messaging networks, and nonverbal communication in public space. So that's what you saw in the video. Also, this came out of a collaboration with 029 in Bogota, a workshop we did in Sao Paulo. It was about building concrete skills. So like starting with the technology, but being like, okay, the technology is too expensive. But what we can do in this workshop is learn how to communicate non-verbally for our own safety without relying on electronics. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y es el turno de Jasmine Rault, quien es profesora asistente en Cultura y Medios en The New School en Nueva York. Rault trabaja temas de feminismo y afectividad, queer y economías culturales, y tiene un nuevo trabajo sobre lo efímero, The Labor of Being Studied in a Free Love Economy. El primer libro de Rault es Eileen Gray and the Design of Sapphic Modernity, Staying In. El proyecto de su libro actual es Transnational Mediations of Feminist and Queer Effect, The Arts of Activism in the Americas. Bienvenida.
Hola, gracias. Y yo también tengo que decir, lo siento mucho porque voy a hablar en inglés también. So I think that the angle that I'm taking on questions of justice here is a slightly oblique one, which I think we all are doing on this panel. But one of the things that my talk is going to be addressing is how to think about other models of justice when the ones that we've been using or the strategies we've been pursuing have really not necessarily worked out for most of us. So we can think, or I'm trying to frame a lot of our models of justice as having been sort of co-opted by a particular and being born of a tradition of liberal thought that is now neoliberal thought. Then, of course, liberalism itself is born of a product, born of a process of colonization and colonial modernity. So I'm thinking about justice from a slightly oblique angle, and I've become interested, let's see if I can do this. I've become interested in those shifting models of affect that communicate incivility and how uncivilized affects are associated with, or as Sarah Ahmed will say, stuck to, certain bodies, those read as poor, black, darker skinned, indigenous, gender non-conforming, trans, and generally queerly inconsistent with the ideal subjects of colonial modernity. The concept of affect is notoriously and productively slippery and difficult to define, but women of color, feminist, and queer scholarship has articulated affect as the regulatory power of feelings, or the ways that dominant structures of power are enacted through dominant structures of feeling, whereby certain tenors of emotion, tone, sensation, and relation operate as the measure of whose voice counts and whose doesn't, whose knowledges count and whose don't, whose lives matter and whose don't. That is the modern colonial measure of the human, or who and what counts as a life worth valuing, is determined not only by who is speaking or acting, but how they are speaking or acting. We can see civility as a mode of decorum, or the inexplicit or inexplicit ways that people are welcomed or acknowledged as subjects that count. Following post-colonial, decolonial, queer of color feminist scholarship, my research pursues what might be called uncivilized affects, which are sometimes the refusal or inability to perform happiness or optimism, but can just as surely include the refusal or inability to perform sober, serious realism. That is to say, depending on context, positive affects can communicate uncivilized, just as jarringly as negative affects. That is, not taking something or someone seriously can register as a sign of incivility just as surely as taking something or someone too seriously. This incivility is typically understood as the mark of what Saskia Sassen calls incompletely formalized political subjects. But I want to think of uncivilized affects as a mode of political engagement for those who are not hailed into the realm of the modern colonial civilized human. I'm particularly interested in how these uncivilized affects are used to destabilize and confuse regulatory, disciplinary, and biopolitical operations of power. So, in the 41 and the Great Raid, Los 41 y la Gran Redada, by Carlos Monsiváis, he gives us a brief history of homosexuality in Mexico, from the 1901 police raid of a party in El Centro, where men were dressed as women, and 42 were arrested for las faltas a la moral y las buenas costumbres, failures of morality and decency or good manners, which was quickly reduced to 41 arrested, because the 42nd was rumored to be President Porfirio Díaz's son-in-law, el primer yerno de la nación, in a case that the rapidly expanding early 20th century Mexican media adored, and so made notorious and still colloquial. From here was born the long-lasting gay euphemisms, joto, for the cell block, joto, or J, where the 42 or 40, where the 41 or 42 were held, and of course the queering of the number 41 itself. Monsiváis writes, it's a strange thing I'm going to do, which is read Monsiváis in English to a primarily Spanish-speaking audience, but it's to spare you all my bad accent. After the raid, homosexuals in Mexico City no longer feel alone. Somehow, in the spirit of the interrupted party, the 41 accompany them, the sign or mark of the existence of the tribe. This spirit of the interrupted party takes the form of a sort of collectivizing, affective resilience that's known in Mexico as relajo. Relajo can be translated into English as fun, but it's an insufficient translation where mostly it's making fun of, or even better, a collective making fun of, an improvised spreading of a joke. So again, Monsiváis says, the starting point of gay resistance is the conversion of fatalism into relajo, of guilt into a fashion show, of condemnation into the ridiculization of linguistic conventions. So, if, so to speak, los maricones, or those fags or queers, did not make fun of destiny, which is what made them, and didn't laugh in passing at some of the social axioms that so cruelly harassed them, they never would have acquired the indispensable identity which is at once the abandonment of hope and the joy or exhilaration of knowing you're alive despite everything. So Monsiváis positions relajo as the central affective strategy for the emergence and survival of queer subjects in Mexico. But relajo has, of course, been famously understood as precisely the affective mode that precludes serious and formalized political participation or effects. Jorge Portilla described relajo as a particularly Mexican pathology. In the phenomenology of relajo, Portilla decried relajo as, quote, he says, the suspension of seriousness, that is to say, suspending or annihilating a subject's adherence to a value proposed to his or her freedom. Or he'll also say the desolidarization of from dominant values. That is, Portilla casts relajo as the compulsion to irreverent collective joking that annihilates Mexico's possibility of gaining its freedom. Several scholars have repeated this sort of assessment of relajo. For example, following Portilla, Diana Taylor concludes that relajo proves non-threatening because it's humorous and subversive in ways that allow for critical distancing rather than revolutionary challenge. So I want to suggest instead that relajo is exactly the opposite of critical distancing, but is instead the sort of critical closeness that scholars have praised in the work of Monsiváis himself. Satire and irony are the forms of humor that are praised as serious and revolutionary, affective strategies that enable the freedom and justice that Portilla laments are lacking from Mexico. But the genealogy of satire and irony are also explicitly tied to Western European political culture. Portilla, for example, spends most of the phenomenology of relajo juxtaposing irony and satire to relajo. Irony needs and allows a critical distance, a seriousness, responsibility, an orientation to freedom and focused values, which he explicitly associates with Socrates, Kierkegaard, Shakespeare, Dickens, etc. For Portilla, relajo signifies the structure of feeling that sabotages Mexico's participation in the serious project of Western modern colonial civility. Carlos Alberto Sanchez has argued that Portilla's phenomenology in fact articulates relajo as a sort of anti-colonial critique of modernity, but a critique to which Portilla himself, because of his own investments in Western modernity and Western philosophical traditions, could not fully commit. That is, precisely because of its performance of critical closeness, a lack of distance, or serious adherence to established or focused values, relajo can be understood as a decolonizing structure of feeling. And in my work, I trace the central critical importance of relajo in queer feminist performance in Mexico, specifically in the work of political cabaret artists like Jesus Rodriguez, Liliana Felipe, Tito Vasconcelos, Regina Orozco, Astrid Haddad, Las Reinas Chulas, Cesar Enriquez. These works are sometimes directly or pedantically or seriously focused on one or two topics or political messages, but more often they invite us into a kind of meandering, collectivizing exercise in not taking too seriously the dominant structures of power through which we operate, those that coalesce into normative genders, sexualities, racialization, nationalism, and class. That is, they do the work of making fun of the disciplinary and regulatory promise of happiness. They ask us to take improvised collective pleasure in non-cooperation, of the sort that the Zapatistas model as well, and that Pietro Ameglio described the other day. So I want to end this little talk by thinking about how a reading of relajo in queer cultural production in Mexico might let us think again about the queer significance of non-serious affects in other contexts of the Americas. So I'm going to bring us quickly to Thompson Highway, the celebrated Cree writer who lives in Canada, and is referred to as perhaps, quote, the most famous spokesperson for the trickster worldview. I'm going to show you a short excerpt from the keynote address that Highway gave this past June at the Encuentro of the Hemispheric Institute for Performance and Politics, which met in Montreal. I want us to think about the ways that he theorizes, but also uses pleasure, joy, and laughter. A decidedly oblique relation to the seriousness expected of an opening keynote at a major international conference. So I'm going to see if I can get this to happen. What's happening? Okay, I'm going to tell you a bit, and then I'm going to summarize some of what he said, because he talks really fast, and I am, again, so sorry that I do not have subtitles. I tried, and I failed. So I'm going to say some of what he says, but I'm going to let him say some of what he says as well.
Madam, I have to excuse me. feel absolutely nothing to do. I have a ridiculous laugh. But don't worry about it. My friends always laugh about my laugh because it's the most ridiculous laugh on the face of the planet. But don't worry about it. I'm having it surgically removed and replaced with a bark. This is the last time you're going to hear this laugh. You're going to notice that everyone's so it's really silly. Please, don't laugh. See? I also like to laugh a lot, so it's very hazardous.
Okay, so he goes on to talk about the Cree language, and that Cree comes from what he says, the laughter of a cosmic clown, as he, she has been called. A trickster, he, she comes in many guises, which is why Cree has to be the world's funniest language. Each syllable is a kick in the pants, a poke in the bum, a quality not helped by the fact that my dialect of the language happens to be the fastest dialect of any language anywhere on earth. Brochet, where he grew up in northern Manitoba, was converted by French Roman Catholics in the mid-19th century, and to this day that's why the fastest Hail Mary in the world can be heard there. My mother used to say her rosary with such blinding speed that sparks could be seen flying out of her mouth, and one day set the priest on fire. He goes on to conjugate several verbs in Cree, telling us, you see, even the verb to suffer is funny, and to explain that Aboriginal languages divide the world not into two genders, as European languages do, but into that which is animate or inanimate. The facts of this can be contested, but this is what he's saying. He connects this linguistic production of and reliance on gender binaries to the ongoing violence against as well as mass murder and disappearance of Indigenous women in Canada, officially over 1,200 cases unsolved right now, which doesn't count the number of cases that are understood as closed, and of course is a much larger number if we think about the families and intimates involved. This is the official number. He suggests that we need 56 genders, at least, for the number of times that the Cree woman, Helen Betty Osborne, was stabbed in the vagina with a screwdriver. And then he moves into a description of Cree understandings of the body. So this is a couple minutes.
Take this equation of animate, inanimate, one level deeper. All the parts of the human body by themselves are inanimate. The head by itself, and Imamistiguan, has no soul. You will notice that the article anna has now been replaced by the article anima. That hand, and Imamichichi, has no gender, has no spirit. Even the heart by itself is soulless. Penis, dead as a doorknob. Sorry, boys. In fact, the only other human parts of the body that by themselves can have a soul are the vagina and the womb. And then there is one other organ that, because of the nature of the English language, I am forbidden from telling you about. An organ that by itself has a soul. You'll just have to guess which one it is. I'll give you 3 hints. First hint, both men and women have it. Second hint, it lives in the center of a certain garden. Which garden? Think of it this way. European languages were evicted from a certain garden. The garden of joy, the garden of beauty, the garden of pleasure. At a certain point in their emotional history. Aboriginal mythology, theology, has no such narrative. You can rummage through the warp and weave of the Cree language forever and you will never find it. It was therefore Northern Alberta still garden. Unbelievable, isn't it, to think that such a constant airs still exists. Because it is the very center of that original garden. Beauty, pleasure, joy, that is the garden of the human body. That third human organ, that by itself is a soul, lives. Third hint, it is the human body's funniest, most ridiculous little part. Birthplace of the trickster, that cosmic clown. You might hear it tonight as you're brushing your teeth or squeezing the black out of your face. In the mirror, I plan to do that tonight. I love blackheads. In English, it will disgust you because the garden of finally is disgusting in that language. In Cree, you will laugh until you weep. All right, I'll give you the fact. The third organ that by itself has a soul is the anus. Ever hear a fart? Want to hear one? You're laughing. The birthplace of laughter. Birthplace of the trickster. From which concept, in any case, arises wonder of wonders, the concept of a female god who laughs. Laughs and laughs and laughs and laughs. Etc., etc. A subject that can 10 books could not possibly address it. Not even 100 books. You'll take the entire 21st century to mine through the mountain of information.
Okay, so for highway, and I'm sorry if you couldn't hear much of this, I can tell you more when it's no longer my time that I'm taking up here. What he said, if you want to know. For highway, decolonization is a matter of keeping the laughing trickster of Cree and other indigenous languages, cultures, and worldviews alive. He locates this laughter, the same giggle that Highway can't suppress, throughout his talk, and which I suspect contributed to so many people walking out during this keynote presentation that he gave, suggesting later that he didn't seem to be taking it seriously. In the decolonization of gender, sex, and pleasure, of the body and its relationship to language and power, I don't want to suggest that the prioritizing of non-phallocentric and trickster humor is somehow innate to any Cree or any other indigenous cultures. Highway is notorious for inventing as much as he reports on indigenous histories and cultures. He's a storyteller. But instead that we see it as at least as hard-earned, learned, achieved, as we've come to see anger following Audre Lorde on Black feminist uses of anger, that it's a skill that we use strategically and that we come to, we don't just simply get born with. Studying queer feminist performance in the hemispheric Americas means carefully attending to the various and contextually specific affective modes by which normative relations of power are disoriented.
Muchas gracias por las presentaciones, que fueron muy interesantes y arrojan muchos puntos que considerar y que pensar. A mí me gustaría hacer como dos especies de preguntas, comentarios para iniciar esta conversación. A lo largo de este SITAC se ha estado hablando de la relación entre ética y arte, muy enfocado en el tema de la justicia. Al hablar de ética hay una noción que es difícil de superar, que es la del compromiso. Y aquí también se ha hablado muchas veces de este compromiso a la manera de esta demanda infinita. Creo que lo que no se ha dicho mucho es que esta demanda infinita es un proceso arduo y pesado y que por eso muchas veces no se consigue, se cae en cuestiones de simulacro, de traición, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Si nos enfocamos en el trabajo de algunas personas, algunos escritores que lo han analizado como válido, por ejemplo, o en el caso de Simon Critchley también. Y menciono a Simon Critchley porque no solamente se menciona como parte del programa, sino que él dice que una de las formas de poder como sobrellevar esta demanda es a través de distintas estrategias, ¿no? Y él habla del humor. Y ustedes están hablando también de distintas estrategias, no sé, en el caso de Micha Performance, en el caso de Jasmine, ciertos afectos también como relacionados con la cuestión del humor. Y lo que, bueno, a mí en lo personal me gustó mucho fue también el caso de Amaranta y está como llamado al amor como una especie de demanda ética, ¿no? Como reconocer la riqueza del otro, ¿no? Independientemente de lo que sea. Entonces, si pudieran hablar más de eso desde sus perspectivas, ¿no? O sea, como de sus propias prácticas. Ese sería un asunto. El otro asunto que también las tres han hablado es sobre estos modelos de homogeneización, de cómo se entienden distintas formas de entender la sexualidad, el género a través de ciertos modelos de homogeneización, ¿no? Que estos modelos de homogeneización no son solamente dependientes de lo que se conoce como heteronormatividad, pero que también se han forjado a través de algo que yo podría llamar como homonormatividad, ¿no? Y cómo a través de esta cuestión que muchas veces tiene que ver con ciertos estilos de vida, prácticas de consumo, olvidamos cuestiones como las que Micha mencionó, ¿no? Como, hablamos sobre el matrimonio, pero descuidamos cuestiones de seguridad social o de seguridad, de cualquier tipo de seguridad, ¿no? También llegamos a relacionar a ciertos individuos con ciertos estilos de vida, ¿no? Como también decía Amaranta, ¿no? Trans, como estilista, no hay oportunidad de ver otro tipo de cuestiones.
Reflexionaba un poquito ahorita sobre en el propio movimiento LGBTI, más las siglas que se acumulen la próxima semana, también habría que hacernos una autocrítica también, y es necesario cuando estamos en esta crisis de país. En los últimos 20 años la lucha se enfocó mucho al tema del matrimonio igualitario, ¿no? Y pareciera ser que se volvió como casi la única agenda. Y cuando eso se da en México, pareciera que ya no había otra agenda más que seguir. Y nadie hablaba sobre desempleo, salud, educación, ¿no? Otros temas que pareciera ser que no eran necesarios, pues, ¿no? Y el Estado dio una vuelta de tuerca cuando les dice, bueno, está bien, cásense, pero no tengan hijos y no adopten. Entonces, el tema el tema del parentesco, por ejemplo, como una posibilidad en donde el afecto de dos personas del mismo sexo pueda transmitirle a una niña, niño o lo que resulte ser, el Estado regula finalmente, pero la perversión también tendría que ser, y en eso radica la autocrítica, habría que pensar que tanto la comunidad LGBTI también hemos complicitado en un punto para llegar a esto que digamos la normalidad, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el costo que estamos pagando por pertenecer a esa normalidad? Y si esa es la ruta que tendríamos que tener. Yo creo que éticamente tendríamos que repensar nuestras rutas, ¿no? Y en ese sentido me parece que, como decía Micha hace rato, la gran oportunidad de que lo trans, por ejemplo, ¿no? Hay un estereotipo en que hay que traer siliconas, hay que traer una peluca o peli teñida, zapatillas de tacón. Si no cumples este estereotipo, no entras también en esta norma que se está produciendo. Y ahí se pierde la gran riqueza, ¿no? Como he mencionado, de las otras identidades y las otras posibilidades de ser. Que además es una realidad, ahí están. No podemos seguir negando sí, no podemos seguir negando. Y creo que la negación también es un asunto de reflexión ética.
Well, I think that certainly I want to respond to the problem of not just homonormativity, but homo-nationalism, right? Which is the ways in which certain forms, articulations, and embodiments of gay and lesbian, and one might say we are at a tipping point of possibly even trans, at least in the US. People are being folded into the life of the nation, are being utilized and rewarded for certain kinds of militarized imperialisms and neocolonialisms. This certainly doesn't mean that all gays, lesbians, and trans people are in fact being rewarded by the state, and certainly in a place like Canada, where I'm from, you learn quite quickly that, sure, gay marriage, whatever, that is nobody's primary survival need in life. Housing, education, food, income, etc. are the questions. we need to be looking to, and that a lot of activists in Canada, in the US, in Mexico, and throughout the Americas are doing. So, for me, this is part of, I think, what I am interested in the idea of uncivilized or uncivil modes of relating, those things that are read as not worth being rewarded by the state, those modes of being that are understood as either not serious or in fact, more along the lines of the language we're used to, fully disposable. And so this is why my orientation to the uncivil is to think about the ways in which various forms of racialization, gender, sexuality, and nationality play themselves out at the borders of what's acceptable for reward, the borders of what's going to be rewarded by power.
¿Alguien del público que tenga alguna pregunta?
Hola. Porque resulta que también soy el titular del Centro Cultural del Bosque, y en esta sesión de cierre pues quiero agradecer, quiero felicitar a Aimé, a María, a Lucía, a todas estas mujeres, ¿no? que nos han hecho, que nos han dado la oportunidad de traer a ponentes tan importantes. Les quiero dar las gracias y la bienvenida. Dicho lo cual, a nivel ya personal, hablando desde mi lado de público, me da especial gusto, había reservado, no quería ver, no había hablado, pero ahora me da mucho gusto hacerlo en esta mesa de cierre con estos temas de transgénero, que no puedo evitar pensar que lo transgénero, lo transhumante, lo transdisciplinario está íntimamente ligado con esta idea de movimiento, ¿no? De traslado, de lo que va de un lado a otro, lo que trasciende, y eso nos recuerda que es lo vivo, ¿no? Es lo que está realmente, lo que está opuesto a todas estas ideas que nos paralizan, que nos quieren aniquilar, que nos quieren dejar quietos, que nos quieren dejar como una sociedad del espectáculo debordiana, completamente pasiva. Creo que es a lo que venimos a escuchar aquí, a recordar que estamos vivos. Y pues solamente quiero de verdad decirles que me da mucho gusto que esta mesa de cierre sea con Micha, con Amaranta. Agradecerles y felicitarlas. Muchas gracias.
So, of course, I love everything that was said, particularly, the comment around that we need to interrogate ourselves. This notion of, well, Cornel West talks about Socratic energy, and how the need to not only to interrogate oneself, but interrogate your community, interrogate society, interrogate cosmology is utterly important. But the self-interrogation, the examine life, in order to do that, it comes at a cost. One of the things that Malcolm X said is that the examined life is painful, but the unexamined life is not worth living. And so this notion around pushing beyond ourselves, so I'm thinking about the larger LGBT community who historically has sort of ostracized, particularly not only marginalized LGBT folks, but particularly trans folks. What do I mean? I was going to say this earlier, but I get a chance to say it now. So one of the things that I'm reminded of historically is the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, and how many Black and Puerto Rican trans women, and particularly trans folks, and particularly were part of the rebellion, and that out of the rebellion was a creation of a lot of LGBT infrastructure, economically, cultural, social, where these particularly white gay neighborhoods were created. Castro in San Francisco, Chelsea in New York City, where white gay men particularly could shop, gym, bank, party in a community, and where their economics and politics respond to their communal needs. But marginalized, racially marginalized LGBT folks had to particularly live in what I call the social minefield of homophobia of their respective communities. Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, two of the particular people who were on the forefront of that. So this is 69. And so their bodies have helped to create a movement. We have gay pride internationally because of trans folk, internationally, right? And so 4 years later in 1973, at a gay rally, white gay men resisted against allowing Sylvia to speak as she fought against this crowd and with a hoarse voice to talk about this notion, and it's almost like an omen. So I'm going to connect this to marriage equality. Almost like an omen in 1973, pushing against this piece of white gay middle classism that has ostracized trans folks, right? So much so that 5 years later in 1978, there's a move to eradicate trans women, particularly in the front of the gay parade and the annual gay parade in New York City. Why I say that? Sylvia and Marsha wound up having to live homeless on the pier. So here's these bodies that created a movement, had to wind up living homeless on the pier. Marsha's body winds up found in the river one day after our gay celebration in New York City. And when they pulled her body out, that it was in the water so long that Marsha's an African-American trans woman, that she was white. And immediately they closed the case and said it was suicide. I'm thinking about Sylvia in relationship to a black trans woman named Amanda Milan, who was stabbed to death in Port Authority in New York City while everyone watched her bleed because she was arguing over trying to get a cab, and a cisgender male was arguing with her about the cab, and they sort of settled it, but his friend pushed him and he stabbed her to death while everyone watched her bleed to death, right? The last thing I want to say about this, why I love everything you said, particularly when you talked about Jasmine in different registers, the affect and all this other stuff, I utterly loved it. Let me tell you a couple of reasons why. The only reason why I went back to school, I do public health for a living. I used to work through the Board of Education. When I moved to New York City, I did public health, particularly looking at HIV prevention targeting black gay men and the house ball community, and I was in graduate school getting a master's in education, and I quit. I went back to school to get 2 degrees in theology, not because I want to be somebody's damn minister, absolutely not, but because we have to push against this theological abomination narrative from the church. This is the problem. Homophobia is a theological problem. It is a theological construction, and it's a problem. And it's the only reason why I went back to church. I think about W.E.B. Du Bois when he talks about, in terms of black people, what does it feel like to be a problem people? I'm always saying, what does it feel like to be the antithesis, the theological problem to God, that every day you wake up, you're breathing, your existence is called an abomination. I say that because the last thing I'm going to say, because you know I can talk a lot, that I love the fact that O.G. Lord was lifted up. And this is what I'm getting at to you when you talked about Jasmine and other registers. One of the things that she said was, the white European fathers had told us, I think, therefore I am. She said, the black woman in all of us, the poet, the artist says, I feel, therefore I can be free.
Hola, felicidades a todos y estoy especialmente muy emocionada por escuchar a Micha porque, bueno, estoy investigando algo de su trabajo para mi investigación doctoral y yo quería por eso mismo preguntarte cómo extender este concepto del trans en el trabajo artístico. Y a mí me interesa puntualmente en el trabajo que haces en Transborder Immigrant Tool, justo en esta idea biopolítica del tránsito en el desierto fronterizo de los migrantes. Y gracias, te felicito y estoy súper emocionada de verte.
Gracias. I'm going to respond in English, sorry. Well, so before me, another trans woman theorist, Susan Stryker, wrote this essay in collaboration with Paisley Kara and the third person I can't remember. There's a women's studies quarterly issue on trans, and in the intro they talk about, you know, in the way that in queer theory, they've like, for a long time, they've taken the idea of queer and applied it to other things, theoretically. And so they argue that, you know, they ask, what kinds of operations of trans could we understand, not that are beyond gender? So I'm really excited that now, today, there's a lot of this work being done. I mean, there's like a whole anthology on transgender migration, with lots of great work by different people. There's also a really rich field of people working on trans species. So, you know, I did my MFA in 2008, asking these questions about like, what if I wanted to be a dragon? How do I transition to being a dragon? And now it's exciting, 6 years later, that, not like I came up with it, but it's exciting that there's a lot of people writing about this, like trans species relationships, and how do they inform, like how does a notion of care transformed by the way people care for their dogs? And I don't know, not really, ¿qué más? Yes, there's a lot of that happening, and I think it's important. But I often want to, like, I'm most excited by the work that returns back to the human. Because for me, like, yes, I am concerned about dogs and trees. I am also concerned that trans women of color are being killed every day. I'm also concerned that, you know, every time I leave the house, I know I might be killed for being me. Yeah, so I think that, like, Harlan Weaver is doing some really interesting work writing about trans species, but looking at the, like, race politics of these, like, dogs in prisons programs, and how there's, like, programs in the US to, like, bring dogs to prisoners as some kind of therapy, but then the actual program, like, reproduces some of the racial bias. Yes. So when I have done this work in the past that was like, let's extend trans beyond trans people, it's often still back to return to the issues of trans justice. So, you know, when I was doing Becoming Dragon, it wasn't because I actually wanted to be a fucking dragon. It was because I believed in, like, a radical flank politics, right? Like we would see with the Black Panther Party and Malcolm X. That by doing more radical gestures, hopefully, that we could make space for other people. Like, if there's people that are demanding to be dragons and, I don't know, whatever, some other fantastical thing like robots, then why is it such a big deal that I just want to be a woman? Yeah, so this idea of making space for people. Thank you.
Una última pregunta.
¿Puedo hacer mi comentario? Gracias. Muchas gracias a todos. Y creo que, bueno, algo que me tiene pensando es el reto y el riesgo de hacer visibles todas las líneas de trabajo que ustedes están haciendo. Y es que, por un lado, el tema, digamos, no solo de trans, es justamente producir estos entrecruzamientos para visibilizar las pugnas que suceden entre clase, género, raza, pero el riesgo es el que los entrecruzamientos que están siendo visibilizados se convierten en un token en el cual hay una especie de intercambio en el cual surgen los entrecruzamientos, se visibiliza este campo de posibilidad y los agentes se vuelven en el trabajo ya está hecho porque está visibilizado y no sucede una transferencia hacia nuestros cuerpos y nuestras historias, donde habría que pensar cómo practicamos estos entrecruzamientos en nuestras vidas, y no es porque hay una visibilización, es que el trabajo está hecho, y cómo podemos repensar en nuestros cuerpos y en nuestras vidas, cómo se entrelazan poder, discriminación, autoexotización, en fin, una serie de dominación, una serie de actos y de un ejercicio diario en el cual tendríamos que pensar cada uno de nosotros esta práctica trans de cómo dejar de solamente ser espectadores para empezar a ejercer acciones precisas desde nuestras propias coordenadas, para que entonces se empiecen a abrir, justamente como las expositoras nos han mostrado, muchos campos que necesitan ser atendidos. No solamente conceder nuestra atención hacia algo que se está visibilizando, sino repensar qué hacemos para ser también agentes de esa que es necesario visibilizar.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias por sus comentarios, por las preguntas. Gracias.
I mean, I think that was a good question, and I wanted to answer. Yeah. Well, I think I really appreciate that question, and I think also it goes back to what Michael was saying about interrogating the self, because, like I was saying, I think that by looking at the murders of trans women of color, that requires us to understand an intersectional array of oppressions, right? So there's like racism and sexism and discrimination based on disability and based on citizenship status and all these things, right, that are simultaneously often occurring for trans women of color. And so this is my question for all of you in the audience, which is, how are you reproducing those things or challenging those things every day? Because certainly we are all reproducing or challenging patriarchy and racism all the time. Like in this conversation, like in the last 3 days, I've seen so many misogynist, racist things happen. And I mean, just, yeah, I think it's a thing, it's an invitation to all of us to not just understand this one particular set of oppressions, but to understand how that informs our everyday experience of our own bodies and the ethics of our own actions.
Pues creo que es la mejor manera de terminar con tu comentario. Les agradezco a las tres y al público, y tenemos que pasar a lo que sigue. Gracias.